Welcome to Grief Uprooted, a podcast dedicated to sharing your grief stories. Together, we embark on the mystery of one's grief journey as they learn to live, heal, and be courageous in a world rooted in trauma. Join myself, Christine, in an open discussion to help you uproot the grief in all our lives. I am an award-winning author, professional speaker, and humanitarian in the field of grief and trauma. I want you to be part of the discussion. Today, I am very excited to have Dr. Lisseth London. She's an international trauma specialist and human rights activist. Dr. London has a social work background and holds a doctorate in international psychology. She's specializing in trauma services. Dr. London has taken the call to accept her mission to support others in understanding the trauma impacting one's interpersonal and intrapersonal, transgenerational, and community cultural dynamics. One of Dr. London's proudest projects has been creating a space for trafficked survivors to find refuge in Nigeria. I can go on for hours about this amazing woman, but I want you to meet her personally, and I want you to follow this and really take check of yourself. Not only of the grief you're experiencing today, but what have your ancestors, what have the people that came before you experienced? Welcome, Lisseth. I am so excited to have you here.
Hello, I'm excited.
Well, this is a super heavy topic, and I can't think of a better person as a friend, colleague, to have this conversation with.
Mhm.
First off, I really want to know, as that's what this platform's about, sharing your grief story. What brought you to this work, this enormous amount of work? And like I say, you are a member of so many things, part of so many things. And what really made you look at life and go, this is where I want to be? Or did it choose you?
Um, so to kind of answer that question, I have to go back. So I'm originally from Panama, and so my family migrated here in 1995. I'm saying years, so people are starting to calculate my age. Please don't do it. And so when I transitioned here, it was very traumatic. Like many people, anytime you transition or change your routine from as a child, it can impact you tremendously, right? Childhood traumas and all of that stuff. And so I didn't recognize the severity of it until I got to college and I was experiencing the burden of it because there were so many moments from my childhood till then that it was just back to back to back traumas on top of being losing normalcy, losing your home, losing family members along the way. It was just a lot. And so I was pre-med because I wanted to be a OBGYN doctor, and I ended up doing a work study program at a community center. And that was during the time that we had an influx of refugee and asylee members from Iraq and Iran. And so there was just an influx coming in. And I was working with them, and a lot of their stories that they were sharing mirrored a lot of my stories. And I was just like, and I kept being pulled in, and decided to change my major to go to social work. So I would say that it was part of me all along, but it was something that was pulled out of me in college because I was able to sit in front of someone who went through the same journey as me and say, oh, this is why it has been feeling so personal. And so from that moment on, I just dived in like hardcore into working in the social service field, understanding trauma from a transitional place and from a uh, war, disaster, any impact of trauma, right? not only just man-made, but world, everything, our own personal trauma, society, community. And so I just wanted to get deeper into it. And so I just kept going and kept going and kept going until, here I am. And I have been honored by this journey. I have been humbled by this journey to be able to understand trauma from a cultural context. Not only to understand what I went through, but to see it in so many others' lives.
Oh, I love what you said because I think where you're picking up the grief, and I think this is where a lot of people say, I've not experienced grief. I've had a life. It was normal for you. I hate to say
It
that,
was.
but it was part of your life and
Yep.
part of your culture. So
Yep.
this was acceptable in a kind of a level. And it wasn't until you got out there at that age and went, wait a minute, like, why am I experiencing this? Why am I feeling this? And other people are experiencing that. Where I think a lot of times we look at grief and we think, well, it's got to be like somebody died in front of you, or a loved one passed, or this experience was directly impacting. And this, you know,
Right.
um, is part of your culture, part of who you are. And
Yeah.
that has to be tough. That
Yeah.
that and I feel for you. I know I'm not going to make it through this podcast.
I'm prepared already.
Because it is such a heavy topic.
Yeah.
Um, to live a life with grief and not know it's walking beside you, I think it's really,
Hmm.
really hard. And
Yeah.
the last year working in Indigenous reserves and with Camp SOAR and things like that, I've come to really, in the last 24 years, see the level of pain that comes with that. And it is a really unrecognized pain,
Hmm.
um, but it is so heavy and horrible. Um,
Yeah.
so I think it's fantastic you're in this industry because you're helping so many. Um,
Yeah.
and I would love to just kind of dive into that in the difference in grief between it historically being traumatized or within communities. Um, like, how do you deal with that grief? Like, what's really, I guess, the fundamental differences if in living a life like that, and that grief walking next to you,
Hmm.
compared to, yeah, I really don't know where to go with that, so I'm throwing it at you.
No, it's very difficult, and I want you to understand that it is in order for us to understand this topic of
Mm,
grief that is literally embedded into everything that you are as really people of color, Black, Indigenous people of color, diverse communities. It is part of their DNA,
mm,
and it's when you recognize that it is something that it's already part of you,
mm-hmm,
then you are able to say, okay, that's what it looks like. Okay, that's it. That's what I had to recognize because
mm-hmm.
I didn't understand it until I was sitting in front of it. And not because we normalize it. We're like,
Yeah.
it's just like, whatever. And they're like, no, 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 no. This is grief. And
Mm-hmm,
this is the grief that has been attached to you that
mm-hmm,
you have been holding and carrying for years and years and years. And so when you're um Alicia Fournette actually said it beautifully. She said, "People of color are often grieving a loss of hope and safety,
mm,
in addition to
yeah,
someone's life."
yeah,
So it's like we are already grieving.
mm-hmm,
Period.
yeah,
We have an ongoing, continual grieving within us. We grieve our safety. We grieve our hope. We grieve our community. We grieve the injustice. We grieve the transitions.
mm-hmm,
We grieve so many things already, and it's it is right.
mm-hmm,
And so when something happens, another trauma, right, losing a loved one,
mm-hmm,
seeing someone in your community that passes away or whatever it may be, it doesn't have to be a loss of a life, it can be a loss of something.
Yeah.
It that grief, it just intensifies it, right? Because grief now activates the other layer of trauma
Yeah.
that we have as people, right?
Yeah.
And so when you're speaking about the community that you go and support, the indigenous people,
Mm-hmm.
it's already embedded in them.
Yeah.
And so when we go in to talk about grief and try to reconcile or try to understand or try to bring some type of understanding into it, we have to understand that that is them.
Mm-hmm.
And then the layers on top of that is what we're also trying to peel off as we go along. But it's so rooted. It's like you said, grief is so rooted into who we are.
Yeah, and
So
that is one of the biggest things I think people are missing
Mhm,
on all levels. I
mhm.
know I just want to back up, and it's called BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, and Other People of Color. That's the
Yeah,
acronym they use, right?
Black Indigenous people of color. Hmm.
Yes. And I think it is rooted, and nobody's recognizing it. Nobody's and Camp SOAR that I started for Indigenous communities. SOAR stands for Spirits Our Ancestors Rekindled. I'm gonna go there. That's about the graves because you know I whew, in working with them and standing there um, over graves where babies are buried, children are buried. It's hard not to feel the
Mhm.
pain,
Yeah.
and that's why it's called Camp SOAR, because I believe these spirits were brought back to open this conversation, to heal people. And um, it's time to have that conversation and for people to support and make it known that this grief is rooted. It's rooted in these people, it's rooted in these cultures. And
Hmm.
we have to be of service to help them through it. But the very first thing they have to realize is that it's rooted in you, that it's there and it exists. And it is okay to accept that. And it is okay to work through that.
Yeah.
And I think that's the hardest thing when people think about um, how do I start to move forward? So I know one of the words you used, I'm going to try to say it, ethnotrauma. Am I,
Ethnotrauma. Hmm.
what exactly is that, and how does that blend into this story?
Oh, I love it. So ethnotrauma
Hmm.
is actually something that I've coined. I
Hmm.
created this term because I was so tired of people saying trauma
Yeah.
and just saying, and it doesn't really encompass it or like wrap around itself into cultures, people who have experienced layers and layers and layers of trauma.
Yes.
And so ethnotrauma is the psychological trauma experience of Black, Indigenous people of color. But I go further than that and I say Black, Indigenous, diverse ethnic communities.
Perfect.
And so, and those ethnotrauma is looking at the suffering
Hmm.
from from the impact of those trauma, unresolved trauma, current traumas, right? But also the vicarious traumas that are happening externally, right? What we
Mm.
are seeing continuously. We are dealing with the trauma that is in our history,
Yeah.
right? And how we are responding to that trauma.
Hmm.
But we also have to recognize the approach to how we heal within our trauma or
Hmm.
how the language of grief, which is something that I'll talk about more later, but
Mm.
the language of grief and the language of how we do healing, our practices, and how we communicate when we are experiencing something that we're carrying from our ancestors, but also something that we're constantly experiencing current.
And I think that's one of the things carrying from your ancestors. I don't think people can relate to that. And
Mm-hmm.
I think when you experience that or witness that in a culture, having
Mm-hmm.
the honor of working the front lines in moving in and living with different cultures and grief, um, it's obviously had a huge impact on me. But to witness that and see that their ancestors are very present and that grief is very present. And
Mm-hmm.
them trying, in a culture trying to understand and process what happened before them and how they can forge forward. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
we need to heal it for the next generation. But
Yeah.
there's so many triggers. Like there's so many triggers. Like you turn the news on, trigger. You there's just so many that
It's too
I
much.
sit and I think, even just having the conversation about what I do. I walk into a room and people are like, oh, she's going to talk about death, right? And right away, it triggers me to go, don't talk about your career, don't talk about your career. And then I just watch these other cultures and I'm thinking, I'd be like a firecracker constantly going, okay, why is this bothering me? Why is that bothering me? Why is my, and being able to just balance myself through that.
Mm-hmm.
Because I feel like you're being traumatized over and over and over and over and over and over again. And then you
Yeah.
wonder why you can't function. You wonder
Yep.
why can't I move forward? Why can't I process? Um, and I know we'll get into that, but I love that you've named it something because I
Yeah.
think that makes it real. You know,
Mm-hmm.
ethnotrauma, that makes it real. This exists.
Yeah.
And now is the time to step up and go, okay, let's do it. Let's talk
Mm-hmm.
about it. Um,
Yeah, because it looks at the violence. It looks at
mhm,
violence. It looks at loss. It looks at respect. It looks at dignity. It looks at integrity. It looks at all of those things that we often don't think is attached to culture, is
yeah,
attached to
exactly.
trauma. And when we think of trauma, everyone thinks of the most
Traumatic thing.
harshest moment, dramatic thing.
Yeah.
And it's like, no, it is
Yeah.
like when you tell someone in a cultural world saying I the grief that you're experiencing is loss of hope and safety, like wait,
Yeah.
that's not grief, that's just an inconvenience or something like that. And
Yeah.
they're like, no, this is the loss of, like, I'm grieving
Yeah.
not being able to have hope, not being able to be safe. And this is something that I'm experiencing, my grandma, my mama, everybody.
Yeah.
And it's just, that is a grief that is scary. And so when people understand it, like, and see it in that way, they're like, oh, okay, that's what that is.
Yeah.
But it's just, I say that grief has gotten a bad rep sometimes.
Yes. And
Because, yeah.
you brought me to this other point that um well, two, was working in a women's shelter,
Mhm.
and a beautiful Spanish lady had been badly beaten, and she came into the shelter and she had recognized who I was, because we use different names and things like that. And she said, the grief you've experienced and seen is by far worse than mine. And I looked down at her and I said, no, not even close. Yours is
Mhm.
worse. And she went, why? You're alone. There's nobody. That's why. I said, you're grieving alone. And as that minority, you're even more lonely. I go, no, it's something to be done together. And,
Yeah.
when you're talking about how you're being raised by parents, I think this is a key thing. I've never heard it talked about, and maybe you can comment on it. When you're raised in a family, your mother gives you different values, different things to say to you. So
Mhm.
um, they raise you with specific patterns and thoughts, and then we all grow up and say, oh, I'm like this because my mother did this, or my dad did that, this is why I'm dysfunctional, all sorts of crazy stuff. But in your culture and in my culture, I'm sure we were raised completely different, and I'm sure your mother taught you different things than I was taught, and that
Mhm.
creates who you are. So if that mother was grieving, my mother was grieving the loss of her son. She was extremely protective, and I had to learn by that. So when I became a mother, I became extremely protective of my children. So I think that people are missing when they say, well, it's ancestral, it's generational, it was back then. Yeah, but over the years, those
Mm-hmm.
parents taught their children how to be safe, how to talk, how to look at people, maybe how to hide, maybe how to deny who they are, maybe to say, we're not good enough to do that. Or they could say, you can take on the world. Whatever those parents did, they passed it down to the next generation.
We interrupt this podcast for a dirty moment.
I'm triggered by grief. I'm triggered by death, actually. And that is the thing that I feel sometimes paralyzes me. And even though I am in the trauma field, it is the side of my humanity that I am, sometimes feel the human emotion of that. And I have to take a moment and process. And that is definitely my trigger. I've been around so much death um, that it is, I don't think it will ever go away, that trigger, for sure. So, yeah, death is definitely my trigger. Seeing children is definitely my huge bigger trigger than that, but just death itself is my dirty trigger, I guess, my dirty memory or whatever. I don't know what it's called, but it is definitely one of my biggest triggers for sure.
And how does that child then go, okay, so how do I grow up and get married? And what do I teach my children? That's where generational grief comes into play. And so
That's
many
it.
times working with people, it was when we opened that up and said, we have to call our ancestors, literally, physically, and spiritually, and say, we need your help because
Mm-hmm.
we cannot heal this generation and the next until we can gain an understanding of this all. And that's where these conversations, need to be taken. They need to be had. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but I think we just shy away from them for numerous of reasons. Um,
Yeah.
but I do think that's a topic that needs to be talked about. So when you talk about the language of grief in all of
Mm-hmm.
this, um,
Yeah.
I'm fascinated by it and how it's expressed when it's something you've walked with. And I think that'll be something in this podcast, grief, it is intertwined into who these people are in different cultures. And how do you
Mm-hmm.
walk with that? And how is that grief expressed? Um, that's a really interesting topic.
Yeah, one of the things that to answer something that you mentioned earlier in people understanding and being able to ask their ancestors for support in terms of how to deal with the grief and how to understand. I go to Ghana like all the time. Every year I usually go. This year I won't get to go. I'm so sad,
Mm.
but it's okay. One of the things that they do in their culture is, they have slave castles from back in the day and all of that stuff. And so they, the door of no return, where they
Yeah.
walk the slaves through and then put them in a boat. So in 2016, I believe it was when President Obama, I think it was during that time, I can't remember, but they had a welcome back. So, and they created a door of return
Mm.
for people from all over the world to come back and to be able to reconcile, to be
Wow.
able to give some type of connection back to what has happened with their history. There is by the castles, there's another area, it's called the Last Bath. And there's a ritual that they do. People can participate in this, where they walk in and they take off their shoes
Mm.
and they walk through the path where the slaves were taken to, where the river, where they get their last bath before they go into the castle. And in that, the tour guide, who is we will say, call them here a shaman or something, but they're spiritual guys who are very well known about the history of the people. They go in and they speak to you about the journey and what's going on, and in their conversation, they ask you to be open to talk to your ancestors and
Wow.
to ask your ancestors, what it is that they their dreams, what they wanted, how they felt, and also for you to tell them where you are, what you've done, and so that you can then get guidance and say, how do I heal? How do I do better? How do I whatever? And I went through that process, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, Lisseth, whatever, but it was so emotionally amazing to be able to, for someone who has walked with grief for so long, to be able to go into this space. And again, I'm from Panama, and every history, location, everything is everywhere, but to connect where I could see my family, I could see my lineage, I could see something. And I was standing there by the water, and all I heard was that my ancestors were proud of me. And to feel that, I all immediately began to weep, And this is something that I wish individuals could understand when we're talking about understanding generational trauma, historical trauma, transgenerational trauma, whatever we want to call it, is in it. The whole point is for us to be able to heal from the pain that we have endured, but also the pain that we're carrying from our parents and their parents and their parents and their parents. And at some point, we as humans, we all want to be able to be here, like someone telling you something like, hey, you're doing great. You are breaking this, and you are stopping the grief here. You are acknowledging the trauma here. And to be able to hear that was the most amazing thing ever. And so when individuals, especially looking at the ethnotrauma, we as people who are grieving, we have to understand the history. Yeah. It does, from every culture, it doesn't matter. You can come from any, whatever area you are in, you have a history of trauma because your parents raised you out of their trauma response because of what their parents raised them in. Yeah. And you are carrying that. And so there has to be a conversation with yourself in awareness that says, okay, was this healthy? Yeah. Like me being a strict and like very overprotective is that because of my trauma and what I experienced, or because of something that I see and I need to protect? Because you have to have that conversation with yourself. Yeah. And once you acknowledge that, then you can say to yourself, oh, okay, that was the grief that I was carrying. That's the trauma that I was carrying. And you then tell yourself, oh, okay, this is where I stop here. Yeah. And that's when you tell yourself and your ancestors, hey, I'm aware of this. Yes. And I checked that off. Like, I'm good. Thank you so much for that. And that breaks that for your children and their children's children. So I wanted to bring that in there in regards to your last point.
Yeah, I love that. And so take me back to this place because I think that's phenomenal. And when you call your ancestors, is there anyone particular that comes forward for you that have experienced an enormous amount of trauma or walked that path and as you say, walked through the door and didn't come back? What was that like, just physically and emotionally being there? Like, was there anybody that came to mind for you, like grandparents or something, just to think that they went through that?
I couldn't see my grandparents or great grandparents, but I did see this small, fragile woman. And that's who told me, like, I'm proud of you. Keep doing this. This is your calling. Like, in 2022, when I did the last bath, that's when I heard you are in the right path. And so I dived in harder into this trauma work because it has been a calling. When you go through grief and things like that, you're like, why am I going through this? Like, can you tap me out? Like, exactly. And like call someone else. And so when I was there and I went through that, the last bath, and it just clicked that my journey was for me to understand and be compassionate about other people who are grieving, right? One of the things that is, that people need to understand when that was happening is when you're dealing with compassion regarding a grief of something, you have to just listen, right? You have to listen and be mindful to not over like, oh, well, I think, you have to maintain a stance of just being respectful of your with your curiosity. Not like, oh, well, what is that? Like, just be respectful and just be mindful. Limit your assumptions of what you think it is, and you have to explore the history, which is why, like, understand what it is and who is this person before you even try to recognize something like that. And I know that Dr. Harris is the one that talks about grief, this process of this. But I wanted to add another part because that's what I saw and felt when I was there, is that you have to be open to shifting your beliefs.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with compassion regarding grief and trying to reconcile, trying to heal or get a grasp of healing, because grief is something, unfortunately, that is still so embedded with us that we learn to manage. It doesn't heal and go away all of a sudden. We learn to manage it, and so it's important for people to understand that, and you have to be compassionate with yourself. And that's one thing I work with my clients.
That's hard.
We are not compassionate with ourselves when we're dealing with grief. We like, no, we gotta put, and we gotta do, and we gotta
survive. That's
like pull yourself on the bootstraps.
Pull it together and survive. And I'm like,
no, you don't. Like, sit there.
Yeah.
Sit there.
Just take a deep breath for a moment. And
you haven't regulated. How are you making decisions without being regulated? Like, you're gonna make a decision that you're gonna regret later. So why don't we just sit here?
Yeah, and
just take a moment.
And I think one of the things that you said that's really important is making peace with that ancestor, and allowing them to then be at rest and you be at rest. And then being able to process that and go, okay, now how am I gonna approach this with my children, with the next generation? How are we going to look at this? But being able to accept and understand that your ancestors are there and this happened. And it's integrated. It's integrated into who you are. Your grief has always been there. It's always been part of you. Obviously you realize it at some point, but to release that is so great for your ancestors, for yourself, and for the next generation. The ability to do that, it's an enormous feat, an enormous task, and some people will never get that. So it's great to hear that you had that opportunity to do that. But you're fearless and you dive in. But when you look at your grief now and back at that language, like if you're tackling grief or you're to feel it, like, is it easy to talk about? Is it easy to do you recognize it coming out of you at times? Working with individuals in this career, I find myself, it taps into my emotions. I tell everybody right up before my podcast, everything, even when I'm working with you, I can talk through the tears, but the tears are really, I can feel the pain, and I'll never fully understand it, but I understand that there's pain, and it's just something, the way my spirit works is that way. And I always encourage everybody to express however they need to express, and know that it's okay, no matter how that is, as long as it's not via anger or hurting people. But how do you find the language of your grief in particular? And then we'll talk about other people.
Well, I understood this term or this model because of a article that I read back in 2014. It was talking about the language of grief, understanding the expression of our when we are in bereavement, right? And one of the things is that the language of grief is very, very intimate. It is our way of expressing. It's our authentic self.
Yes.
It's the best way to describe it. It is, no one is going to do it like you. It may look like you, but no one does it like you. It is your own language.
Yeah.
And how you express. I learned, so in 2015, I lost my aunt, who was my second mom. And that grief was so bad that I literally isolated. I literally quit my job, packed up my car, sold everything, and I was like, I'm going home. I just can't. I could not fathom why. I couldn't figure out how to move or how to make sense of things. It was so hard. And I remember this article that I read the year prior, but I remembered it in 2016, which is a year after she passed. And because I was going through so much and I couldn't understand what was going on, I was making decisions out of my trauma response that was not, it didn't align with my calling, but it was the way I had to do it to cope.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to shame anyone. And when people are like, when someone does and move out of their trauma response, sometimes it's for safety. Sometimes it's for that moment to be able to breathe again.
Yeah.
And so the moment you recognize that it is a trauma response, that's when you have to be like, I got to shift back.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But I learned that my response was, caring for others at the detriment of myself. Right. And because I dived in hardcore at that point, I went back and started working with traffic victims. And I was, 90-hour weeks, and it was just, and I was just in it, and I was just like, and I was just tired, but it was numbing the feeling of the grief that I was experiencing, until one moment I was just like, I can't breathe. Like, I literally cannot breathe. And I had to pause, and I thought I paused, but I didn't actually. When you're like, I play pause, like, I play pause. And then literally in 2018, my nephew was born and he was premature. And that grief, on top of that grief, literally shut me down. Like, I could not function. When I tell you, everything has been was a blur during that time, because I didn't take care of myself. So my language of grief was very much of ignore myself, pretend like it's not there. Feel it. No, ignore it. We have to understand that whatever your language is within this, however you express your grief, it is your language.
Yeah.
And you will be surprised of how much you utilize that language in other things.
Yeah.
Like work, relationships, anything. Yeah. And I recognize that because I had to understand my emotion, how I responded to it, what I perceived, how I anticipated loss, how I anticipated how I was going to move, how people responded to how I was going to move. Mm-hmm. I was constantly doing that because, again, that was my language of grief. Nice. I was trying to understand others when I was supposed to understand myself. And so I recommend people read The Language of Grief. It's a whole thing. It was a whole study. So that people can understand what their language is. Because some people are like, how do I express my grief?
Yeah.
Some people don't know.
Yes.
And it helps people to understand how you have that conversation with yourself and how you express your emotion, how you express your emotion and grief, how you heal with that grief, right? Heal. And quotations. and then how you transform or respond, because all of those things is your language.
Yes, exactly. And I think that, when we talk about cultural background, there's already that underlying grief. And then we take that into this life and we go, okay, now we're going to experience grief firsthand. And you try to figure yourself out. You try to go, okay, what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to function? One of my biggest beefs, and I know everybody listening hears me say it pretty much every podcast, we teach our children how to make children. We teach them how to create life, but we don't teach them what to do when life dies. And I so think if we started teaching them that grief is part of the circle. Yeah. Like when we create life, we have to understand when we love something that we will also one day grieve that. And that's a given. That's just a given. And we need to give them those skills to learn what is your language? What is the language of your culture for expressing grief? And some cultures don't have a language, and others have a very loud language, and it can be done in symbolism. It can be done in storytelling, all these different ways. And I think you're so right in reflecting on yourself. I tell people, I have to talk. It drives people insane. I know that, but I ruminate on things because I need to talk about them and allow it to integrate into who I am slowly.
Yeah.
And that causes me to cry. I wear that emotion very freely now that I'm older and I'm no longer hiding it, because I realize it's just a physical reaction of my body. And when I try to hold that back or bottle it, I physically become sick. I'm like, I do not feel well. And so I'm that person who says, we need to have this conversation, or I need to talk about this, or I need to express my emotions surrounding this. And I think so many people in society today are like, hold it together, push it down, just let it go. That happened before. Let's, and it's like, you can't. You have to recognize it. You have to. So I guess
they don't understand that you cannot just dismiss it. The reason why you have to acknowledge it is because everyone is unregulated because of the grief. And because of that, you are making decisions out of your trauma, out of the pain. Like in some cultures when they grieve, they rip their clothes. So they walk around, and when someone sees that there's a ripped part of their clothes, they know, oh, that person is grieving. Some people have to wear black, or when they're in the mourning period. Some people wear white in their mourning period. Like my side of, I'm born in Panama, but my dad's side of the family is from India. So when people die, then we wear white. But when I go to funerals from friends and families around here, you wear dark colors. And so it's like understanding the culture of grief. It's important, but it's they have utilized these resemblance of they're grieving, let's not talk about it. We have now put it into things like that so that we know that's what's happening, but we don't have to talk about it. And unfortunately, when you don't express, like you're saying, and you don't express, it bottles into you, you can get sick because you are, again, pulling in. If I would get into it, then I wouldn't be me. The body keeps the score, right? From Bessel van der Kolk. We're talking about how when every traumatic experiences that we experience is kept within our body, the tension continues to build where our organs feel it, our mind feels it. We are a biopsychosocial, spiritual people. We feel it physically, mentally, emotionally, our social, our community, and spiritually. right?
Yeah.
We feel every single thing. And so when we do not process
Yeah.
grief, it impacts all of us holistically.
Yeah.
And so if you don't process, start to look at, is my body different?
Mm-hmm.
Is my mind different? Is my community? How am I how I'm integrating with others? Is it different?
Mm-hmm.
What I believe, is it different? And if you can say yes to any of them, that means that you haven't been processing things out.
That's right. That's exactly right. My study in university was after my brother died, I had fallen and they thought I had bone cancer in my legs. And
Mm-hmm.
I ended up going through surgery. And this doctor, before he wheeled me in, he used to call me Sunshine. And he's like, Sunshine, I have no idea what makes you so sad. And I remember saying to him, like, if don't wake me up if I'm not going to be able to walk. And when I woke up, he says, well, you must have had an angel looking over you. And I was like, what? And here I was, this teenager. I just wanted to smack this doctor. And he goes, you have osteomyelitis. It's a bone infection. He goes, I have no idea why a 14-year-old would have this. So during my study was the effects of bottling trauma and grief. And
Mm-hmm.
it has been proven that the body will shut down.
Yep.
And I bottled everything. Never, my real name is Nikki. And I just went, that was Nikki. That happened to her. And I went on to graduate with scholarships. I went on to get married, have a great life. But there was always this thing rattling. And that's really what switched my whole life around when the jar fell to the ground and somebody else died. And I went, oh my goodness. And what had
Mm-hmm.
happened to me? Um, because if we physically don't realize it, we just keep doing that with every trauma. We just keep piling it in and piling it in. And then eventually the system starts to go, whoa, there's something wrong. There's something really wrong. And it can't do what it's meant to do, which is heal your
Yeah.
body. And because
Yeah.
it's so wrapped up in everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's where I think people need to check in with their language of grief and go, one, is it existing? Like for a lifetime, it's already there. We just haven't
Mm-hmm.
seen it. And is it that underlining thing that's triggered by that first death or by that first experience? I think that's
Yeah.
why it's great in school systems. We're teaching about culture and different beliefs and history, because I think kids need to understand this and know this. But let's just talk about grief a little more in school systems. I
Yeah.
think that would be fabulous one day.
Yeah.
One
It,
day.
I love your example. One of the things, and I've never shared this with anyone, and I'm going to share with you, and your listeners, of course. So when I was in college, I got into a car accident in 2009. Again, stop doing the math, people. Don't count my age. 2009, I got in a really, really bad car accident. I was driving from Minnesota to Nebraska in a car in the highway because it started to snow, T-boned me. And I was bouncing between him and the median, just back and forth, where his front bumper ended up inside my car.
Wow.
And I was so in shock, when your adrenaline just kicks in.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh my goodness, oh my goodness, oh my goodness. And then everything was a blur after that. And when I woke up, I was in the hospital, and the nurses were like, "Oh, I'm going to tell you something so funny. Guess what? Your name is London, and the guy that hit you, his last name is England." And I was like, like,
Yeah.
like I just experienced something. I'm waking up. I don't know how I got here, and then you're telling me that. And so I want to fast forward now a year or so in. I was in so much pain where the doctor said, "Oh, you have fibromyalgia." And I was like, "Fibromyalgia? Oh my goodness, what is that?" And so he was telling me like, "Well, your body just has a lot of pain, but we don't know where it's coming from, blah, 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 whatever."
Mm-hmm.
And so I ended up going, again, remember, I went through the whole trauma stuff, and I was getting into the whole field. And I moved to Washington State for my grad school. And I met this short lady. Her name is Randy. We'll never forget her. She was all trauma. She worked in the prisons with the most like literally the people who are the most psychotic. That was her term. The psychotics, that's my jam. She said,
Yeah.
Lisseth, that's my jam. And I was like, okay. And she was like, you seem like you're in a lot of pain. I was like, oh yeah, they told me I have this, but it just doesn't go away. She's like, you have trauma.
Mm.
And I was like, what do you mean? She's like, you have a lot of trauma in your body.
Yeah.
She's like, come here. And so after class, we sat down and she just started talking to me. And immediately I started to feel the pain. And as she's going and I'm responding to her questions, I could see the little girl, the transition from Panama. I could see the moving and the making a decision to switch degrees. I could, like, all those things were coming. And I was bawling in this classroom with this little short lady talking to me. And she was like, Lisseth, the fibromyalgia is your trauma.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
And so we went through and talked about it. And again, I'm not a medical doctor, please hear that well. But after that, I will tell you, I did not feel any more pain like that. Like that intense, like annoying, I can't get comfortable pain. Yeah. I released everything when she was talking to me. It was like an hour or so. And I didn't feel it. I didn't feel it. And so at the end, when I graduated, she came back to me and she's like, have you been feeling any pain? I was like, no. She's like, you are trauma free. Now go and do great things. Yeah. And so I remember that and understanding this, how grief can unprocessed grief, thinking that it's normal. It is what it is. Other people don't need to hear it. As you continue to store it, it can be so hard on your body and your psyche that you start to feel things that that you're like, it doesn't make sense. Like how I'm a healthy person, but why am I feeling this? I'm a this and I don't like. And so if you can just sit down and process and literally go through each and everything. I can speak spiritual and religious here, right? Is that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
Bring it on.
One of the things that it's important is, again, for cultures of people of color, is religion. It's very embedded into everything.
It is.
That belief system. And so one of the languages that the study really didn't talk much about, but I, of course, added on to is the language of religion into the grief. Like when we grieve, the acceptance is our worship, right? The processing thing is the prayer, right? We're praying through it. When we are in need of family, or we're, in community, we are in congregating with other believers, it is connected to that. Like, so, which is why the BIPOC groups are so much in the spiritual religion space, because that is their way to process grief the best they can, to be with others who are also experiencing grief. And so I recognize that in my journey, because I had to release it so it didn't come back. We talk about David, anytime he grieved something, he ripped his clothes and like lay down naked on the floor and like rub ashes on him. Yeah. We talked about Naomi, right? Ruth's mother-in-law, who grieved the loss of her 3 sons who all died, and changed her name. Yeah. Like, these things are valid things that are happening, and when it happens now, we think like, oh, they're crazy, or they're like, oh, we need to psycho assess them. And I'm like, no, grief is that strong that all you can do is just, I can't do this. I need to lay here, or I need to change my name, like you said, because I need to disassociate myself from that grief with with who I am. And understanding that is very important. And so thank you for bringing that up, because I don't think people get why they go from Lisseth to Liz or whatever. They change their name because they want to separate themselves from the pain.
That's exactly it. And I have experienced that culture of those fabulous churches and amazing outfits with big, beautiful hats and amazing singing. And it is so cathartic. Like,
Mhm.
just being able to sit there and see people, if to me it felt like people were expressing emotion and they were
Mhm.
doing it in such a vibrant, big way, and everything
Mhm.
was okay. We weren't really speaking about it, but we were expressing it. And it was beautiful, absolutely beautiful. And it takes you to that thought of ancestral grief, where working in different cultures, indigenous in particular, they have that heaviness of that ancestral grief. Addictions seems to happen where people are trying to numb the pain, and that
Yeah.
pain isn't theirs, that's their ancestors' pain, and
Yeah.
they're pulling it forward.
Mhm.
Naturally, it is not something somebody does on purpose, and having to deal with that plus deal with your own life and your own grief. And I think
Yeah.
recognizing that and saying, like, here's all these traditions that we do in action, but we don't verbalize. To be in a culture and people say that's the first time that individual's talked about the loss of their son, you know, I'm floored because I'm
Yeah.
talking about everything right down to when I have to pee, right? I just announce it to everybody. And that was something I
Yeah.
personally said, I no longer am going to be Chrissy, Christine, Chris. My name is Nikki Christine. I know it's a mouthful. Um, and I tend to go by Chris, but it's a full name. And I actually put it together and put it on stuff now. And I made my Facebook
Mm.
page to say Nikki Christine because I'm like, that's who I am fully. That's all
Yeah.
of me. And I think you're right.
Mhm.
People separate themselves because it's too hard to deal with.
Yeah.
And I'm hoping by, a platform like this, that people can come together and go, hey, this is okay to have that conversation. This is
Yeah.
okay to talk about that. And we
Mhm.
all come from a different background. We all carry, that different cross that was laid before we got here.
Right.
And it's how are we going to move forward to make this a better place for our children
Mhm.
collectively, all of them together,
Yeah.
and know that they carry a different cross with them. So, if we were going to look at somebody looking at their own language of grief personally, I
Mhm.
thought this would be kind of interesting or fun to go with for
Mhm.
people who are listening. How would you go about looking at yourself, really? I guess maybe asking yourself a few questions. Um,
Oh,
if
perfect.
yeah, if
Yeah.
I was to throw that out, what would be the
Mhm.
first question you would ask yourself if you were grieving?
Mhm. Um, so one of the things that I do with my clients all the time is I go through the same process.
Hmm.
And this is part of the answer. You have to assess, and once you assess, then you inform yourself. And then after you inform yourself, you have to empower yourself because sometimes
Mm.
what you found out may be a little hard. So you
Okay.
have to empower yourself. And then after you empower yourself, you have to apply what you need, like the tools. And then after you do that, then your resiliency has to match
Oh,
it has to be a healthy, resilient approach.
I got it.
And so when I go through grief, the first thing I ask myself is, now, how bad are you going to do this? And
Mm.
know it is not proper English.
Yeah.
I say it, but how bad are you going to do this? Meaning, like, what is the how are you going to isolate? Like, how
Hmm.
are you going to punish yourself? Are you going to
Mm.
sabotage yourself? Are you gonna be in this cycle of just of unhealthy toxics, like things that you don't process, you don't talk it out? Like,
Mm.
are you going to be bad in terms of like eating things that are not healthy for you? Are you
Hmm.
going to be bad in not moving and not getting exercise in,
Hmm.
so that you can relieve? Like, how bad are you going to do this to yourself?
I
And
love
so,
that. It's like,
yeah.
because, it's like what's your to go to. So I guess for people who are listening, it would be, how bad are you going to do this? Meaning, what's your first instinct? Mine is to eat a whole goddamn cake. I know that's swearing, but that's what it is. It's to get it out.
Yeah.
And I like to eat the cake batter before it's cooked. So, I know it's not healthy.
Oh my
You're
God.
making the
Okay.
cake and I'm just licking the spoon. And that is like literally when trauma hits or I'm stressed, that's
Mhm.
how bad I am. Um,
Yeah.
that's my go-to. So that's a great first question. How bad are you gonna do this? What would be your
Yeah.
second once you realize those are your bads?
Yeah. So it will be so I have a tattoo that I got after
Mm,
my aunt passed away, which is the thing that keeps me moving.
mm,
It's my bootstrap
I love it.
moment
Yeah.
conversation. And it is fear will not paralyze me from my purpose.
Mm,
Grief is definitely one of my fears and one of my things that I'm just like,
mm,
oh, but it will not paralyze me from my purpose. I cannot stay in the bad space.
yeah.
I cannot stay in the sabotage, isolation, punishment, eating bad. I can't stay here because it's keeping me from my purpose. And my purpose is to help others understand what grief is,
Mm,
to help others understand what trauma is, and to understand that you are human.
mm-hmm,
It will happen,
mm-hmm.
but also you have the right to linger here, but
Yes.
also you have to get up.
Yep.
It can't paralyze you. You got to keep going through your purpose.
Mhm.
So that's my thing. It's not necessarily a question, but it's a statement. Like
Yeah.
I
Well,
can, yeah.
I think if I was to put it into a question, it would be, how do you plan on doing this properly? So here's your bad, but now
Mm-hmm.
how do you plan on doing this properly for
Yeah,
yourself?
for
Not
yourself.
for like some textbook or not for your culture, not for your religion, not for how do you plan on doing it for yourself? And since I've
Mm-hmm.
used myself as an example, eating my cake, how I plan on doing that is expressing my grief in a different way. I
Mm-hmm.
love to use the arts. I love drawing, pastels, all that type of stuff. I've even learned chanting, all those different
Wow.
ways. I'm very
Mm-hmm.
verbal, and that's my way. And that's my
I
healthy way.
read.
Yes, and read.
I read, and when my family knows I'm going through something,
You're in a
when
book.
they're like, "How many books did you read today?"
Yeah.
and they're like, and I say two or three, and they're like 300 pages. Like I
Oh.
read and I read, and I. So if in a weekend, if I read 10 books, they're like, okay, something's wrong. So that's my thing. I just sit there or lay there
Yeah.
and just read. Mm-hmm.
Oh, that's such a good one.
Disassociate.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And that's okay. Like a lot of times
Yep.
people are like, well, I shouldn't be doing this or I shouldn't be doing that. Yeah, whatever's comfortable for you and it's
Yep.
healthy, reading is great, right?
Yep.
And I think that's what the arts do for me. I'm able to
Mm-hmm.
take that step out.
Yeah.
And then I think empowerment comes naturally. I think that follows all of that, like you had mentioned earlier, that empowerment comes because you realize how resilient you are. You
Yep.
realize I made it through this
Yep.
and I didn't eat 1,000 cakes. I might have ate one, but that's okay. I'm pulling
Yep.
myself back up and I'm moving. And
Yep.
I think that's the gift of grief. I think a lot of
Yeah.
times people don't understand or are incapable. I think because the pain and the sorrow is so heavy to see
Yeah.
the gift of resilience you're given. And,
Yeah.
to look at those little faces that, nieces, nephews, children, um, the place you've created, your nonprofit, being able to look at that and go, I survived for you. I did this for
Mm-hmm.
you. I'm
Yep.
here fighting this battle for you. I'm not
Yeah.
here for me. My purpose is to serve you. My purpose is to be here. And, I tell people grief chose me. And this is my purpose. That's why I'm passionate. That's why there's this platform called Grief Uprooted. We want to hear your stories. We want
Yeah.
to know how together we can help each other.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you know, that's where I'm going to pull this together. And thank you for coming and being
Mm-hmm.
here and having the most difficult conversation, I think. And that's grief that follows you. Um, and to all my listeners, just to understand that it's there and it's real. As Lisseth said, ethnotrauma, it is within you. Essentially, you were born and that came with you. And to recognize it and know that it exists is when healing comes. It is when we are able to come together in a platform like this and have those difficult conversations. And I know that a lot of you out there are dying to have a comment about it. So don't hesitate. Reach out. I'm going to put Lisseth's website in there, her services that she offers. And I want to hear from you guys. Tell us what you think. Tell us your point of view, how you feel about all of this, and share your grief stories, because it is only together that we will heal. This isn't a journey that we walk alone, people. It is only together. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you, Lisseth. And we'll see you again, guys. Bye.
Goodbye.
Grief Uprooted professional grief and empowerment coaching are not to be used as a substitute for professional advice by legal, medical, financial, business, spiritual, or other qualified professionals. All our products and services are designed for grief empowerment through learning and sharing of one's lived experiences.